Picture a deserted industrial road on the edge of a city, somewhere between midnight and dawn. The streetlights cast long orange shadows across the asphalt. Two cars sit side by side, engines idling with a low, barely contained growl. The drivers say nothing to each other. They don't need to. A figure steps to the side of the road, raises a hand, and then drops it. In that single second, everything changes. Tires scream against the pavement, and two machines disappear into the darkness at speeds that make the surrounding world blur into irrelevance. To most people watching from a distance, this scene looks reckless, illegal, and impossible to understand. But to the people sitting behind those steering wheels, something else entirely is happening. Something that has very little to do with cars and everything to do with the human mind. Street racing is one of those behaviors that society almost universally condemns, yet it persists in every major city on every continent. It happens in the wide industrial boulevards of Los Angeles, the elevated highways of Tokyo, the long desert roads of the Middle East, and the quiet suburban streets of cities people would never expect. It is not a subculture that is shrinking. Despite crackdowns, despite laws, despite the very real danger involved, it continues to grow. The people who participate are not a single type. They are teenagers and grown adults. They are people with steady jobs and people with nothing to lose. They drive everything from heavily modified imports worth more than most people's annual salaries to ordinary cars that look completely unremarkable during daylight hours. What they share is not a car. What they share is a psychological experience that ordinary life simply does not offer them anywhere else. Psychologists who study extreme behavior and risk-taking have identified a specific personality dimension that helps explain why some people are drawn to activities like street racing. It is called sensation-seeking, a term first developed by psychologist Marvin Zuckerman in the 1970s. Sensation-seeking describes the tendency to pursue novel, varied, and intense experiences, and the willingness to take physical, social, and financial risks in order to have those experiences. People who score high on sensation-seeking scales are not simply thrill chasers without direction. Research shows they are often highly creative, socially confident, and drawn to environments where ordinary rules feel limiting. They experience boredom more intensely than others. For a high sensation seeker, a predictable routine does not feel safe. It feels suffocating. This is a critical distinction. The street racer is not necessarily someone who does not understand danger. In many cases, they understand it completely. What they cannot tolerate is the absence of intensity. There's also a strong neurological component to this behavior. The human brain releases dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with reward and pleasure, during moments of high arousal and uncertainty. For most people, moderate amounts of stimulation are satisfying. For others, the dopamine system is wired in a way that requires significantly higher levels of stimulation to produce the same sense of satisfaction. Street racing delivers an almost unparalleled neurological hit. The combination of speed, danger, competition, and the possibility of failure creates a cocktail of neurochemical activity that few legal activities can replicate. There is a man named Adrian who grew up in a mid-sized city in the American Southwest. He was the kind of teenager that teachers described as bright but distracted. He was not angry. He was not troubled in any obvious way. He simply found ordinary life unbearably slow. School felt like waiting. Work felt like waiting. Social gatherings felt like going through motions designed for people whose brains operated at a different frequency than his. He discovered street racing at 17 when an older cousin took him to watch a late-night event on a closed industrial road outside the city. He remembers standing there watching the cars launch and feeling, for the first time in his life, that the world had suddenly matched his internal speed. He started racing at 19. By 23, he had been arrested twice, had his license suspended once, and had rebuilt his car from near destruction after a crash that should have been far worse than it was. He did not stop. When asked why, he said something that psychologists who study this behavior hear repeatedly. He said that when he was behind the wheel at full speed, he was not thinking about anything else. There was no anxiety, there was no self-doubt. There was only the road, the car, and the next moment. For Adrian, street racing was not a death wish. It was the closest thing to fully being alive that he had ever found. Adrian's description points toward something important that goes beyond simple thrill-seeking. It points toward the concept of flow state, the psychological condition identified by researcher Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, in which a person becomes so completely absorbed in a challenging activity that all self-consciousness disappears. Time distorts, worry evaporates. The person and the activity become a single unified experience. Flow state is widely associated with positive psychology and peak human performance. It is what musicians describe during a perfect performance, what surgeons describe during a complex procedure, what athletes describe during a defining moment of competition. Street racers describe exactly the same thing, using almost identical language. The activity that produces the flow is dangerous and illegal. But the psychological state it produces is the same one that human beings have sought throughout history in art, sport, religion, and exploration. There's also a profound element of identity construction happening within street racing culture. For many participants, especially younger ones still forming their sense of self, the identity of a street racer carries enormous psychological weight. It is an identity built on skill, courage, and a willingness to operate outside the boundaries that most people accept without question. In psychological terms, this is called identity-based motivation. People engage in behaviors that reinforce and express who they believe themselves to be. When a young person decides they are someone who races, every race becomes an act of self-definition. It is not merely something they do, it becomes something they are. The element of control is equally significant. Street racing takes place entirely outside official systems. There are no governing bodies, no sanctioned venues, no authorities giving permission. The participants organize everything themselves. They choose the location, set the rules, and manage the outcome. For people who feel that their daily lives offer them very little genuine agency, this degree of autonomous control over a high-stakes environment is deeply satisfying. Psychologists consistently find that perceived control over one's environment is one of the strongest predictors of psychological well-being. Street racing, paradoxically, provides this in abundance. What is almost always missing from public discussions about street racing is its social dimension. These are not isolated individuals acting alone in darkness. They are members of communities with their own structures, values, and codes of conduct. Walk into any street racing gathering, and the social psychology becomes immediately visible. There are hierarchies based on skill and reputation. There is a shared language that outsiders do not speak. There are mentors and newcomers. There are rivalries that carry genuine emotional weight. There is loyalty between people who have shared experiences that the outside world would never understand or approve of. Sociologist Dick Hebdige wrote extensively about subcultures and how marginalized or misunderstood groups create alternative social worlds with their own forms of status and meaning. Street racing culture fits this framework precisely. Within the community, the currency is not wealth or conventional success. It is skill, mechanical knowledge, courage, and respect earned through performance. A person who is overlooked in every other area of their life can become genuinely admired within this world. That social transformation is not a trivial thing. For many participants, it is psychologically sustaining in ways that nothing else in their lives provides. The bonds formed within street racing communities are also frequently deep and lasting. People who race together share a particular kind of trust that is rare in modern social life. They have seen each other in moments of genuine vulnerability and genuine triumph. They have kept each other's secrets. They have helped each other rebuild cars, and in some cases, helped each other rebuild after crashes that changed everything. These are the kinds of formative shared experiences that create lifelong connection. It would be easy to end a conversation about street racing with a warning, with statistics about accidents and lives lost, with a reminder that the behavior is illegal and dangerous. All of that is true, and none of it is irrelevant, but it would also be incomplete, because what street racing reveals at its psychological core is something that extends far beyond the behavior itself. It reveals how urgently human beings need intensity, autonomy, identity, and community. It reveals what happens when ordinary life fails to provide those things in sufficient measure. It reveals that the drive to feel fully alive is so powerful that some people will pursue it even when the cost is extraordinarily high. The street racer standing beside a car at midnight is not simply making a reckless decision. They are responding to something real inside themselves, something that psychologists recognize, something that the rest of humanity shares even if it expresses itself in far safer and more socially acceptable ways. The need to push limits. The need to know what you are made of. The need to find a place where you belong and a moment where nothing else exists but the present. In the end, the road that street racers choose may be dangerous and dark, but the hunger that drives them there is deeply, unmistakably human.